All right. Having now prayed, let's go ahead and we'll grade our quizzes. Um, so go ahead and pass them over and go ahead and get those ready to be graded. This is an easy quiz. Not all of them are easy, but I want to give you guys as much as break as I possibly can. So listing the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The first, obviously, is Genesis, followed by Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. And then the bonus question: what is the definition of the book of Deuteronomy? And that is second law. Second law. All right, go ahead and again give them back and keep up with these so that you'll receive a full grade at the end of the semester. So let's go ahead and we're going to pick up where we left off last week. We're going to jump into the 40 years of wilderness wanderings, and we'll jump in also to the next step, which is the promised land. All right, so they go to the edge of the promised land and were disobedient and were fearful and unfaithful, and so therefore God condemns them for 40 years to wander in the wilderness, and it was for 1 year for every day that the spies had searched out the land. Israel obviously hasn't learned their lesson because they continually complain concerning God's man, concerning the state of affairs. So, so we're going to go look through what happened during this wilderness wanderings, the different signs that God performs, and how He acts on the behalf of the people, despite their grumbling and their complaining. So Israel's complaints. The first was that of the bitter water, and there God heals the water. Then they go to a lack of food, and then manna is therefore supplied. There's a lack of water, and their water, that's where God produces, or God performs the miracle of water coming forth from the rock that was struck. This was Christ pictured in this, and I believe it's Paul that makes reference to that rock that followed them in the wilderness, and that was Jesus Christ. So that when He was struck, rivers of water flowed from that. And so there's then the quality of food. God judges them based on that. They were grumbling and complaining. All we got to eat is this manna. And so God judges them for their grumbling. Then there's the contention over Moses' leadership. God judges them concerning that as well. And then there's a grumbling about Moses himself. God judges those people as well. And then there's the lack of water that God supplies again. But in this time, Moses disobeys because God tells him to speak to the rock, not strike the rock. And therefore, because of that disobedience, Moses was not allowed to go into that promised land. And then there was a complaint again about Moses and the manna, which also resulted in judgment. Now, this was a great condensing of what all occurred in the 40 years of wilderness, and we're going to go ahead and dive into some of these things. We're going to go ahead and dive into some of them. The one that's of most of great note is the rebellion of Korah. Now, this is a really neat thing, and we'll talk about some really cool things about the rebellion of Korah. Was that this was a direct challenge to Moses' leadership. This was led by Korah, who was, by the way, family. He was a Levite, and Moses' house was of the house of Levi. And of 250 important leaders of Israel. And God, through Moses, He issues the challenge and reaffirms their standing, that is of Aaron standing as being high priest by the budding of his staff. He had them all bring a staff, and God was going to answer by who was to be his high priest. But Korah and Dathan and the confederacy, once it was discovered that God had chosen and still affirmed Aaron, those who voiced against him and tried to lead this coup against Moses, the earth opened up and swallowed them. Now, this only provoked the children of Israel even further, because after the fact, after God has dispensed His judgment, the people come to Moses and blame him for killing God's people. It's such a funny thing, and people are fickle, and there's really nothing different than that today. We see a lot of that today in churches. People are upset with leadership all the time. As being a pastor, I'm very keenly aware of it. And so they don't like it when you do it one way, and then they get upset with you when you do it the right way. And you can't. You're not there to please people. You're there to please God, and that's one thing that any minister needs to be mindful of. All right. So here's the thing. Here's the neat thing about Korah. What you'll notice is in the book of Psalms, there are Psalms of Korah. That is, the descendants of Korah wrote great songs of worship. What do I mean? What's so great about this? Don't let your family's past dictate to you what can and can't be done, that you can't live a life for Christ. If this was any evidence of God's grace, I mean, this is it right here, is that there was a whole, that those who were disposed to rat out Moses would later on, their descendants would later on be writing great songs, great tributes to the God of Israel. So let's keep on moving. We're going to talk about that they're on the one side of Jordan. They take the promised land. On the east side, they defeated Sihon and Og, king of Bashan. Now, this is when a really interesting story comes about, is the story of Balak and Balaam. Balak was the king of Moab, and he saw Israel, how easily they defeated Og and Sihon, those two kings, and he feared for his own kingdom. And when he did, so Balak enlists the help of Balaam, the prophet Balaam. Balaam, though at first he was obedient, because God told him that he wasn't to go with these people, that he could only speak the things that he had told him. He fell to the lust of wealth that Balak tried to hire him with. He first sent, he said no to the first payment, said no to the second payment, but that third payment was just, he gave him an offer he couldn't refuse. And so he says, yeah, I will go. And God lets him go, but God is very angry with him. And he sends his angel to stand the way, and Balaam's donkey sees the angel, and he goes around the angel. He goes out of the path and goes around the angel the first time. And then he crushes Balaam's leg the second time, going around the angel, trying to get away from it because he goes into a narrow ravine. But then that second time, Balaam begins to beat his donkey. Each time he does this, but God allows the donkey to speak and opens the eyes of that greedy prophet. And Balaam was asking the donkey, "Why did you do this? Why do you keep doing this?" And then when he opens his eyes and he sees what that donkey had spared him from, the donkey talks to him. And I think it's funny. It's a funny caption in that, because he talks back to the donkey. I've been like, you can talk. But anyways, that's interesting things in the scriptures. It did not obviously surprise him somehow. I'm kind of shocked that it surprises me that it didn't surprise him. But Balaam's donkey speaks to him, and Balaam still goes along his way, and he tells Balak he cannot curse what God has blessed, and he advises the king. And the king says, well, king wasn't going to take no for an answer, so they go to different points of view. Maybe you can curse him from this point of view, or this point of view, or maybe we can go to that hindmost part right there and just curse a few of them. Well, what we see is Balaam tells him time and time again, I cannot curse what God has blessed. And then he comes up with this very wicked plan. He cannot curse what God has blessed, but you can get them to curse, or you can get them to sin, and therefore God will curse them. So he advises the king of Moab to go and send in the women and have them lay with the young men of Israel. Israel began to do this sin openly. And it was the zeal of Eleazar, Aaron's son, the high priest, who went into a couple and killed both with the spear, driving it through both of them. And therefore, that kind of ends that scenario. But then, before Israel is to go into the promised land, Israel is renumbered. Aaron has died, and God has told Moses that his time is at hand. And so that is where the book of Deuteronomy comes into play. This is the second law, or second preaching of that law. And he is repreaching the law that God had given, and he is reminding Israel of their special relationship that they have with God. And he pleads there with the nation based on these facts: God's goodness to them in the past, God's goodness to them recently, and he also reminds them that Israel holds a sacred responsibility to be a good testimony to the nations of the earth. They are also a testament of God's love, God's promise of blessing, and promise of judgment for disobedience. Should they ponder the path of life, it will always be better to obey. So we're going to look at the breakdown in the chapters. The first 4 chapters is the history of Israel from Mount Sinai to that present time. Chapters 4 through 26 is a review and an expansion of the law for this generation. Chapters 27 through 30 review the covenant relationship with God, and 31 through 34 final ministry of Moses. And then we see this is passing on of the mantle of leadership, and now Joshua is in charge. After Moses having gone up the mountain, and there he is buried by God. Now we go into the promised land. This is the next step. They send in 2 spies to spy out the land, and while they're there in the land, they get hung up in the city of Jericho, and they close up the city, and they go into a harlot's house named Rahab, and Rahab tells them that the whole land is shaking and scared or is disturbed because of your presence. And we know that God has given you this land and has promised it to you. And so she hides the spies, and the spies promised that no harm would come to her family if they would put that scarlet handkerchief and tie it to the outside of her home. And so the interesting thing about Rahab in this is Rahab is actually in the lineage of Christ. And that's something that a lot of people don't know. God parts the Jordan River. They walk on dry ground. Joshua sees a very rare form of Christ, the angel of the Lord dressed for battle. And he asks the angel of the Lord, "Whose side are you on?" And of course, the angel of the Lord, "I'm on neither side. I'm on no one's side." And there he commissions Joshua, like Moses. He tells him to take off his shoes because he is standing on holy ground. Israel is circumcised, and they are there resting until the circumcision is over and the pain thereof. And then they go to war and they fight against Jericho. Now, God has a very specific plan in how the fall of Jericho should occur. They are to march around it once a day for 6 days in total silence. And then on the 7th day, they are to march around it 7 times and then yell, and the walls will come tumbling down. They were told not to take any of the treasure. It was to go into the treasury of the Lord. This was like a first fruits, so to speak. They were told to burn and to kill everything in that city. Now Joshua issues a curse concerning the rebuilding of Jericho. When the foundations were to be laid, the oldest son would die, and whenever the gate was raised, the youngest son would die. And this prophecy is fulfilled later on in the Old Testament. Achan's sin and the battle of Ai. If you ever believe that your sin had no bearing or no effect on anyone else, there is no greater lesson than the sin of Achan. God, and by the way, this is also in reference to a tithe too, because this was the Lord's money. Remember, and and he hid a wedge of gold and a few garments and for himself. And you say, well, I've never robbed God. Well, according to Malachi, if you have not given of your tithes and your offerings, you have robbed God. Ai was just a small village. It was just a small village. And isn't it true? I love what Jesus says. He says, I'm the vine and you are the branches. And then he goes on to say, for without me, you can do nothing. I don't care what kind of military might you got. I don't care what kind of, how much armor you have, or how much weaponry you have, or what kind of, it's without God, you can do nothing. This small village held up the whole nation. And Ai, they put them to shame on that first battle. And then it was discovered. Joshua hits his knees and says, "What's going on, God? Why is it?" And he says, "Get up. The nation has sinned, or there's sin in the camp." And then they did it by lot, and they discovered that Achan had stolen a garment and some gold. He and his whole family were stoned. And why would the whole family be stoned? Because the family probably was very well privy to that knowledge and to that theft. They had condoned that theft. One man's sin was a reproach upon an entire nation. Then we see the defeat of Ai. After the first company drew out the fighters, the second ambushed and burned the city behind them, and they put that city to shame. And then not too long after that, they have Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. This was a contrast of two mountains. One mountain is lush, green, and fertile. The other is barren, empty, and desolate. There they rehearsed from Deuteronomy the blessings and the curses of the law with a very vivid picture of blessing and cursings on two different mountains that were right beside each other. And then we have the deception of the Hivites. The deception of the Hivites. They feigned themselves as being foreign travelers that had traveled from a far country to garner peace with Israel. And Israel falls for this deception, but enslaves the people to be cutters of wood and carrier of water for the children of Israel. All the kings of the south, they formed an alliance to try to repel the Israelites from coming into and taking the land, and they were going to destroy Gibeon, which, by the way, was that city that was now in league with Israel. And Israel had already promised them and covenanted with them that they would protect them. They would be under their protection. But isn't it funny, whenever Satan brings things together like this, it just plays really into God's hands. They just made conquering that much easier. See, we were going to have to go to your city, but now, hey, you come to us. And they put them all together in one spot. In fact, the Battle of Armageddon will be very similar. All the nations will come against that city, and God, when we come with Him, those who have been redeemed, that come with that's when He comes with His saints. We're not going to fight or anything. We'll be on horses, and we'll get to be standing there on the Mount of Olives. But all God's going to do is just speak the word, and everything is going to be accomplished, and He will win the battle by just the spoken word. But all these people had come together to fight against Israel, and this just made it that much easier. And this is that battle too. This was that battle where Joshua has the sun stayed and the moon stay still, so that they might finish the work of conquering. And then he continues down in that southern campaign, and they return to Gilgal. And then King Hazor gathers the people that rival the scripture says that rivaled the sands of the shore. This was the northern campaign. God delivers them into Israel's hands, and they burned the city of Hazor, and the rest of the cities were destroyed but not burned. God delivered them in all of the major campaigns, but now it was left to the tribes of the land that were now distributed their boundaries for them to drive out the remainder of the inhabitants. And Caleb conquers Hebron and the children of Anak. This was the cream of the crop, the best of the land. He speaks about his youth and vitality, that he feels just as young as he did 40 years ago. And boy, isn't that something. He had served the Lord, and he was faithful. And this is interesting for those pastors out there or those ministers out there that feel like they have to go through the wilderness with the people. God continued to give him and leave him with his vitality. He gives him his life and gives it to the full. So after that, there's the dividing of the land. They decided who should have what based upon the casting of lots. They set up the tabernacle there in Shiloh. And then we see Joshua's final charge at Shechem. And you know it so well. He says in Joshua chapter 24, verse 15, "And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers which was your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you now dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And then we see Joshua there dies, and the tribes, they inherit the land. But this is significant because we're going to go into the time of the judges. And when Joshua dies, no man took charge afterward. That's going to we're going to just cut it short today. I hope that's okay. We're going to look at next week's quiz. Next week's quiz is we're going to list all the judges with the exception of Samuel and Eli. You're going to have to give that list of judges. So study, read, know who those judges are, and we will see you guys again next week. And we're going to be going at a lightning speed pace, so I encourage you to be ready, study, show yourself to be approved, and please be reading along with us. It grieves me that I'm having to speed through it, but I pray that you would use and make good use of this opportunity to familiarize yourself with these stories before class starts. So until then, we'll see you guys next week. Godspeed.